Hello and welcome to Network News. It's December and that means we've got less than a fortnight to go until what will probably be the biggest shake-up to the railway timetable we'll see this decade. The timetable will come into effect on the 14th of December and the biggest changes are on the East Coast Mainline, which, for the past decade, has seen more than £4 billion invested into it, with numerous infrastructure enhancements, such as the remodelling of King's Cross, as well as a new fleet of electric and bi-mode trains bringing faster acceleration and braking than their predecessors. This will be the first timetable designed to truly exploit the advantages of this investment, aiming to simultaneously increase capacity and reduce journey times. But it's not been a simple journey. The timetable was originally expected to go into effect a year ago, in December 2024, but had to be unceremoniously postponed at the last minute because, frankly, more work was still needed to finalise it. Striking the right balance has proven to be extremely difficult, and the new timetable has both winners and losers. I can't cover all the changes in this video, but let's start with some of the headline items. The new timetable will be the biggest change to the East Coast Mainline in more than a decade, estimated to deliver at least £108 million per year of economic benefit, bringing 60,000 more seats to the East Coast Mainline each week, or 16,000 per day. There'll be 32 new services per day in and out of London King's Cross, and some pretty major cuts to journey times on some of Britain's busiest intercity routes. Let's take a deeper look. The core East Coast Mainline service between London, Newcastle and Edinburgh currently sees 2 trains per hour, but this is being increased and simplified into 3 distinct service patterns that will each run once per hour. Between London and Edinburgh there will still be 2 trains per hour. One will be a semi-fast service that stops quite a lot en route, whilst the other will be a new super-fast service stopping only at York and Newcastle. In doing so, it's able to reduce the journey time from London to Edinburgh from about 4.5 hours to just over 4 hours, which is a pretty significant reduction and forms part of LNER's plan to bring rail's modal share on the route up from 45% to 60%, as the corridor is currently dominated by aviation. LNER's trains to places further north in Scotland, namely Aberdeen and Inverness, will be extensions of the slower service to Edinburgh, which, if you ask me, seems like a missed opportunity, as using the new fast service could have provided an opportunity to reduce the journey time on what are currently some of the longest train journeys you can do in Britain. On the other hand though, stopping more places en route does mean that a greater number of stations retain a direct link to the Scottish Highlands, so I'm not too bothered. Both the faster and slower trains to Edinburgh still miss out certain key stations however, which is why a third service is also being introduced on the route, running from London to Newcastle. This is a key new service that will increase the number of LNER trains out of London from 5 trains per hour to 6 trains per hour. However, the downside of configuring the services in this way is that places such as Durham will be losing their direct LNER services to Edinburgh, though with that said, it'll still be possible to travel direct with other operators such as cross country. On services to Leeds, it'll still be 2 trains per hour as today, but these will be run slightly faster, shaving a few minutes off the journey time and bringing it down to just over 2 hours. Once they reach Leeds, 1 train per hour will terminate, whilst the other will either run to Harrogate or Bradford Foster Square, alternating so that each is served every 2 hours. Speaking of places served every 2 hours, there will be an every 2 hour service to York, which, once the works to deliver a new Platform 3 have been completed at Middlesbrough, will be extended to terminate there instead. However, until that point, trains to Middlesbrough will continue to be limited to 1 train a day in each direction. There will also be 1 train a day in each direction between London and Skipton, and another between London and Hull, though it is worth noting that a more regular service is provided on this route by Hull Trains. Finally, there will be another service running every 2 hours out of London, this time terminating at Lincoln. Now, it's important to note that whilst this is the general service pattern, there are of course exceptions to every rule, particularly for early morning and late evening services, but this is what the trains will be doing for most of the day. Other changes being made on the East Coast Mainline include increasing the number of Transpennine Express services between Newcastle and Edinburgh up from 5 trains per day to 8 trains per day in each direction, running every 2 hours, and running more peak time commuter services between London King's Cross, Letchworth and Cambridge. The new timetable also factors in the new, yet to be opened station at Cambridge South, meaning that by the time the station does open, trains will be able to start calling there seamlessly without the need to lengthen journey times or requiring another rewrite of the timetable. One of the more unpopular changes is that at Stevenage, LNER trains will now be pick-up only northbound and drop-off only southbound, meaning that people wanting to travel from Stevenage into London will have to use Thameslink or Great Northern services instead. However, there's good news for fans of the Intercity 225s, as these iconic trains will be making a return to Newcastle. This is because they're being shortened from 9 to 7 carriages to match the acceleration of the newer Azuma trains, allowing them to be used on the new London to Newcastle service as well as their current duties to and from Leeds. They'll continue to operate these services until their new replacements are brought in the form of the Tri-Mode Class 897s built by CAF. But considering these haven't even started construction yet, we've still got a good few years left with the 91s. Open access operators are also seeing changes to their services on the East Coast Mainline, which I've made a whole other video about. But the quick version is that there'll be one additional Hull train service per day between King's Cross and Hull, northbound only, additional Lumo services between London and Newcastle, running early in the morning and late in the evening, as well as an extension of a few Lumo trains a day past Edinburgh into Glasgow Queen Street, stopping at Falkirk and Haymarket. Meanwhile, Grand Central were also granted the rights to have some of their existing services make additional stops at Peterborough and Seaham, as well as to run some of their empty coaching stock moves in passenger service between Wakefield and Bradford. There's also changes for services which don't necessarily run on the East Coast Mainline itself, but still interact with it, as well as for services which have nothing to do with the East Coast Mainline. We'll start with the first, and perhaps the most high profile. That is, that the East Midlands Railway service between Lincoln and Nottingham is having its frequency doubled to 2 trains per hour, which will see more trains crossing over the East Coast Mainline at the infamous Newark Flat crossing, whilst both EMR and Northern services have been retimed to provide better interchange opportunities with intercity trains at major stations along the East Coast Mainline. There's also some pretty major changes outside the East Coast Mainline. On the Midland Mainline, a new hourly express service is being introduced between Leeds and Sheffield, calling only at Wakefield Westgate. This will be operated by Northern, and ought to provide a good alternative to the current cross-country services which operate on the route as part of their longer distance services. On the West Coast Mainline, it swings and roundabouts. The new timetable will see Avanti West Coast trains stopping at Liverpool South Parkway for the first time, as well as a limited number of Avanti trains per day calling at Hertford. There's also plans for the Caledonian Sleepers Highlander service to make an additional stop at Birmingham International en route from the 15th of January. The new timetable will also see open access making an entrance to the West Coast Mainline. Whilst it likely won't be up and running until at least a few months into the new year, provision is being made for a new service between London and Stirling to be operated by Lumo using a fleet of 6-car Class 222s, second-hand from East Midlands Railway. However, the new timetable will also see several services run by Avanti West Coast being cut. These were originally awarded as temporary access rights, but Avanti's application to make them permanent was rejected in favour of Lumo's new service. One of the services due to be cut was the 7 AM service from Manchester Piccadilly to London Euston, the only service operated by Avanti to complete the route in less than 2 hours. This attracted a lot of criticism from the fact that it would still have to run, just not in passenger service, meaning that what is currently a pretty busy train would instead be departing empty every morning. Thankfully, as I'm editing this video, it's just been revealed that this train will still be allowed to run, but even in spite of this, there's still quite a few services being cut. If you ask me, this all seems a bit backwards, as the whole point of open access is that it grows the market by using empty slots in the timetable, but here we're seeing that services run by the state-backed operator are being cut in favour of the private operator. Yes, they were only awarded as temporary access rights, but given there was a desire to make them permanent, it still seems pretty weird. So those are some of the biggest changes being made as part of the December timetable change, but there's plenty more smaller changes being made to more localised services all over the country, as happens almost every timetable change, so I'll leave a link in the description to the National Rail website's overview of some of the most significant changes, as well as the dedicated East Coast Mainline timetable website, which has been one of the main sources for this video, and a video by VT390, which provides a slightly more detailed overview of the new timetables for both the West Coast Mainline and the East Coast Mainline. It's also worth noting that all the services I've discussed in this video won't necessarily be introduced right away. For example, the new service between Leeds and Sheffield isn't going to be made permanent until the 27th of December, and there are also several other services I haven't spoken about which LNER are hoping to introduce from spring 2026, but these will be subject to a review of the timetable's reliability once it's had a chance to bed in. Speaking of which, it's time we move on to some of the drawbacks and criticisms of the new timetable. The first is that some of the smaller stations on the East Coast Mainline are set to lose out as express trains are prioritised over local and regional connectivity. I've already spoken about how Stevenage passengers will no longer be able to take LNER trains to London because of new boarding restrictions, and how places like Durham are losing their direct services to Edinburgh, but other places set to lose out include Berwick, Alnmouth, Morpeth and Retford. The cuts to regional services seem to be less bad than had been proposed in previous iterations of the timetable, such as the one which had been planned to be introduced last December, but are somewhat unavoidable in a timetable which is really set up to prioritise the long-distance expresses. The other major criticism is that with all these additional services, the capacity of the East Coast Mainline is really being pushed to the breaking point, with reliability on LNER services expected to fall by almost 9%. As a particular example, the famous pinch point across the Welwyn Viaduct was concluded by Network Rail to have a practical performance limit of 18 trains per hour, or a train every 3.5 minutes. Yet this new timetable seeks to push that to 19 trains per hour at certain times of day. Performance also won't be helped by the fact that several infrastructure interventions designed to help deliver the new timetable won't have been delivered by the time it goes live. The new platforms at Darlington have been delayed until spring 2026, and the addition of a third track to the north of York has had its funding suspended by the government. I'm not saying that this new timetable is going to be a repeat of May 2018, but I certainly don't expect punctuality to improve either, and certain groups such as ScotRail have actually objected to the new timetable on the grounds that late running intercity trains from England will have the potential to negatively impact the performance of trains in Scotland. Other criticisms of the new timetable are that it includes little to no provision for growth of freight traffic over the East Coast Mainline, and that the increased number of trains could cause power supply issues by increasing the draw on the overhead lines, something which isn't going to be helped by the fact that Lumo and Hull trains are hoping to run more double-length units, Grand Central is planning to replace its diesel fleet with new tri-mode trains, and that freight operators are switching towards using new bi-mode Class 99 locomotives. All of these will increase the draw of current from the catenary, and so it's likely that Network Rail will need to either invest more into boosting the power supply, or impose limits on the number of electric trains which can use the line. Speaking of new trains, there's a few other changes being made in December which aren't necessarily part of the timetable change, but are worth discussing. East Midlands Railway is expected to introduce the first of its Class 810s in December to replace the Class 222s, whilst GWR will also be introducing a new fleet of 175s to help replace the short-form HSTs they have operating in Devon and Cornwall. The 14th of December will also see the first electric trains running in service on the recently electrified line from Glasgow to East Kilbride, as well as a rollout of simplified rail fares across Greater Manchester's 96 stations, which is expected to reduce the average fare by 5.6%. In the southeast, the area covered by contactless ticketing is also being expanded on the 14th to include 30 new destinations such as Aylesbury, Dorking, East Grinstead, Letchworth, Luton, Princes Risborough and Stevenage. So, the new East Coast Mainline timetable. On balance, it's been an incredibly difficult job to manage multiple competing agendas, and striking the correct balance was always going to be extremely difficult, which is why the timetable had to be pushed back further and further to ensure that everything had been accounted for. Still, once introduced, the timetable will achieve its goal of increasing capacity and reducing journey times along the route. It's likely that over the next few years we'll see a few teething issues and minor tweaks will be made here and there, but for the most part I think this timetable is here to stay. However, the trouble with exploiting all the available capacity on the East Coast Mainline is that there's little to no scope to allow for future growth. Sure, you could add the odd flyover here, do a stationary modelling there, lengthen trains from 9 to 10 or 11 carriages, but at some point you've got to accept that there's only so much you can achieve on the existing network before a new line is needed. There was one planned, but the government is currently in the process of selling off all the land that had been bought for it, which I've no doubt will come to massively regret in about 20 or 30 years' time when the East Coast Mainline will be creaking at the seams even more so than it is today. So the future seems bright in the short term, but longer term, not so much. But what are your thoughts on the December 2025 timetable change? Obviously the headline changes are for the East Coast Mainline, but given that there's plenty more changes affecting services all over the country, I'd be curious to hear what you make of any changes happening near you. Without doxing yourself, obviously. If nothing else, it's good to see that the billions of pounds spent upgrading the East Coast Mainline will finally be put to good use. I'm hoping to do more in-depth explainers like this in the future, so subscribe to Network News for more updates like this. But until next time, have a nice rest of your day, and thanks for watching.